Hello and welcome to the UCA SU election results for 2015. Before I announce this year's results, I would like to say a big thank you to everyone who has voted in this year's election, to every candidate for having the courage to stand for all of the positions available, and finally a big thank you to all of the UCA SU staff who made elections possible this year. Without them, we would not have been able to deliver the elections so smoothly. The elections have been signed off as a free and fair election by the returning officer, and the running order for the results will be as follows. Firstly, I will go through the results for the campus council positions, starting with Epsom, then Canterbury, then Rochester, and finally Farnham. Then I will move on to the elections for student trustee, then NUS delegate, and finally the results for your campus officer team for 2015-16. We will start off with the elections for campus council positions. Firstly is the result for Epsom Campus International Officer. There were two candidates in this election, Foleyemi Davis and Reopen nominations. There were 77 valid votes, and in the first round, Foleyemi received 73 votes and therefore is duly elected as Epsom Campus International Officer. We will now move on to the elections for Canterbury Council positions, and firstly we have the results for Clubs and Societies Officer. There were two candidates in this election, Jessica Thomas and Reopen nominations. There were 123 valid votes, and in the first round Jessica received 107 votes, and therefore Jessica Thomas is duly elected as Canterbury Clubs and Societies Officer. The second Canterbury election is for Students with Disabilities Officer. There were two candidates in this election, Bianca Bolton and Reopen nominations. There were 129 valid votes, and in the first round Bianca received 124 votes and therefore is duly elected as Canterbury Students with Disabilities Officer. The final election for Canterbury is for the Student Experience Officer. There were three positions available and there are two candidates, Michelle Wenmouth and Reopen nominations. There were 125 valid votes, and in the first round Michelle received 115 votes and therefore is duly elected as Student Experience Officer for Canterbury. We will now move on to the elections for Rochester Council positions, and firstly the election for Multicultural Officer. There were two candidates, Ayuni and Reopen nominations. There were 112 valid votes, and in the first round Ayuni received 105 votes and therefore is duly elected as Rochester Multicultural Officer. The next election is for Clubs and Societies Officer in Rochester. There were two candidates, Joshua Brand and Reopen nominations. There were 121 valid votes, and in the first round Joshua received 115 votes and is duly elected as Rochester Clubs and Societies Officer. We now move on to the Rochester Further Education Officer. There were two candidates, George Brabham and Reopen nominations. There were 112 valid votes in the first round, George received 104 votes and is duly elected as Rochester Further Education Officer. The next election is for Rochester Women's Officer. There were two candidates, Kaylee Anderson and Reopen nominations. There were 118 valid votes, and in the first round Kaylee received 112 votes and is duly elected as Rochester Women's Officer. The next election for Rochester is for International Officer. Again, there were two candidates, Sankavi Balsingam and Reopen nominations. There were 109 valid votes, and in the first round Sankavi received 101 votes and is duly elected as Rochester International Students Officer. The final Rochester Campus Council election is for Student Experience Officer. There were three positions available here and three candidates, Tasmin Brindley, Julia Mason and Reopen nominations. There were 125 valid votes, and in the first round Tasmin received 92 votes and is duly elected as the first Student Experience Officer. Tasmin's votes were then transferred, and in the second round Julia was duly elected as the second Student Experience Officer at Rochester. The final Campus Council elections is for Farnham Council positions. The first election in Farnham is for International Officer. There were two candidates, Candice Riley and Reopen nominations. There were 148 valid votes, and in the first round Candice received 136 votes and is duly elected as Farnham International Students Officer. The second Farnham election is for Multicultural Officer. There were two candidates, Madalena Svitlik and Reopen nominations. There were 148 valid votes, and in the first round Madalena received 140 votes and is duly elected as Farnham Multicultural Officer. The next election is for LGBT officer Farnham. There were 2 candidates, Dominic Leith and reopen nominations. There were 149 valid votes, and in the first round Dominic received 145 votes and is duly elected as Farnham LGBT officer. The final campus council election is for Farnham environmental officer. There were 2 candidates in this election, Leanne Lawrence and reopen nominations. There were 147 valid votes, and in the first round Leanne received 141 votes and is duly elected as Farnham environmental officer. The next election is for student trustee. There are 5 places available in this election and only 3 candidates. They are George Brabham, Thomas Morton and reopen nominations. There were 422 valid votes cast in this election, and in the first round both Thomas Morton and George Brabham were duly elected as student trustees. The next election is for the role of NUS delegate. There are 4 candidates for 2 places here, and they are Dodie Casma, Joel Goldman, George Brabham and reopen nomination. NUS conference rules mean that 50% of all delegations must be made up of self-defining women, so we count them as 2 separate elections. This year, the 2 successful NUS conference delegates for UCA SU were Dodie Casma and George Brabham. Now we finally move on to the big positions, the campus officers for 2015-2016. The first election is for Canterbury campus officer. There were 2 candidates, Ellie Webb and reopen nomination. There were 361 votes, and in the first round Ellie received 337 votes and is duly elected as your Canterbury campus officer. Our second election is for Epsom campus officer. There were 2 candidates, Sylvia Duroftai and reopen nominations. There were 333 valid votes, and in the first round Sylvia received 304 votes and is duly elected as your Epsom campus officer. Our third election is for Rochester campus officer. There were 2 candidates, Scarlett Hooper and reopen nominations. There were 316 valid votes, and in the first round Scarlett received 296 votes and is duly elected as your Rochester campus officer. Our final election is for Farnham campus officer. There were 3 candidates in this election, Rhiann Hill, Charlotte Lawrence and reopen nominations. There were 387 valid votes cast, and we had a winner in the first round of voting. Reopen nominations received 14 votes, Rhiann Hill received 155 votes, and Charlotte Lawrence received 218 votes, and therefore Charlotte Lawrence is duly elected as your Farnham campus officer. So to complete your campus officer team for 2015-2016, it is Ellie Webb, Sylvia Duroftai, Scarlett Hooper and Charlotte Lawrence. Thank you very much to all of the candidates and all of the voters in this year's elections. A full breakdown of votes cast will be available at www.ucasu.com.